Hey there, Lorenzo here. I wanted to create a short video on the security considerations when we are using LLMs with tools. So, for this example, I have a simple case where I create a tool to interact with the Postgres database. So let's go through that example. So you will see on the repo that I have a README file with the Docker commands to start the Postgres instance. And I also have an init file to create some data. For this case, I'm just creating customers and orders data, and we'll have two tables, customers and orders. And you will see that I'm also creating a read-only user, which we will use at the end of the video. When it comes to the code, here we have I'll be using two scripts. One, very basic, to show first, why we need tools or why we may be interested in setting up tools with LLMs. So if I were to run this script, let's look at what this script does. So the idea here is that we are making a call to the Anthropic API. I'm using the Cloud Sonnet model for this case. We are able to pass the input here. So just to show what happens if we don't have tools, I'll ask a question about the database. So tell me about how many orders are there. And what we expect to happen here is that the LLM doesn't know about which database I'm referring to, and we clearly see that on the answer. I don't have access to any database system or data to check order information, which makes sense, right? Because the LLMs, they are trained on the internet, but it doesn't have any information about our specific database. If we take a look at the second script right here, so we are again using the Anthropic API, but now we have a connection to a database. And if I scroll here, I'm passing tools. So this is how you use tools within the Anthropic API. And what we are doing, again, we have the same conversation, but we are going to be analyzing. First, we are going to be passing the tools within the prompt. And what the LLM is going to do, it is going to decide. First, it's going to have access to the tools, and then it's going to decide whether it needs to use any of the tools. And if it wants to use any of the tools, it will return that in its response. So we are going to handle that. If the LLM responds saying, hey, I want to use a tool, we are going to be calling on that tool and then passing that to the LLM back so that it can get an answer. And for this case, we only have one tool, and that is to run a SQL query. And we are also going to be passing, if I scroll down here, this is our system prompt. We are saying you are a data analyst, answer questions by querying a Postgres database, a schema, and then we have a function to get the database schema. So no need to worry there, but we are giving a little bit of more context to the LLM. If we look at the, let me pull this side by side. So if we look at the process tool calls, the LLM will respond with the tool that it wants to use, and it will also gives you the parameters. In this case, on the input schema, we just have one parameter, and that is the SQL query. And in order to see all this, we'll have a conversation JSON file. So let's look at that. So I'm going to let's look at the conversation. So So let me delete all this. So we have blank slate. And let's look at what the LLM does. So we see that now it's generating a query. Then we are executing the query. That is something important to emphasize, is that the LLM is just telling us, okay, I want to use this tool, but then it is up to us to actually execute that tool. So let's see, let's look at the conversation again. So we have our user prompt, then the assistant responded with a tool use, the name of the tool that it wants to use, which as you see it matches the tools that we specify, and then we have the input parameters. And correctly here, it is getting the count of total orders. And it knows that because remember that we are also passing the schema. We are then executing that query and we are passing the information as a JSON content, and then the assistant with that information gives us the final response, which is that there are 16 orders in the database. So now, the point that I'm trying to make in this video is how to think about security and the possible things that can go wrong with tool usage, and in this case, how we are interacting with a database. So what would happen if I say, update all the orders before March 32, and if we look at the look at the data here. So what columns do we have? We have quantity, let's say price to 10. So again, the LLM, will have access to the tool, and let's see what. Wow, see, so in this case, the LLM followed our prompt, and he went ahead and updated the entire database. So this is where it gets a little bit dangerous, because we are giving access to our database, and if we don't have any control on the prompts, then stuff like this can happen. And you can imagine I can try also to delete the database, so we really need to be careful. So there are a couple of ways to go about this. We can analyze the query. So whenever we are getting the query to be run by the LLM, we can analyze that and see which type of statements it's making. We can also instruct the LLM to only use select statements in this case. Or the approach that I like the most, it is at the database level and only having a user that has read-only access. So within the Docker command, within the init SQL, let me paste that, because here I have the steps to create a user, so I'll save that. So now we see that we are creating a read-only user, and if I go back and I now update the database connection, let me start again, and for the purpose of the video, let me recreate the data again. So now we're going to say, let's make the same query. And now what we see is that correctly we have a permission error, because the user that we used to connect to the database was read-only, and the action that the the action prompted by the LLM was to update, so that did not work. And that is how we can prevent, in this case, put some rails when we are using tools with LLMs, because otherwise, we are getting a lot of capability from the LLMs, but we need to be careful on how we use them. That's all I wanted to show in this example. Thank you.